Our gospel reading this morning comes from Luke's gospel in the 24th chapter, verses 36 through 48, and is Luke's account of Jesus' appearance to his disciples following his resurrection. While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." The disciples were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. And Jesus said to them, "Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I, myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written that the Messiah is to suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I have to admit that when I saw that the lectionary passage for this Sunday was a very similar story to the one that was assigned for last Sunday, I was a little frustrated. Why would anyone want to hear or to preach on the same story for 2 straight weeks? And there are a lot of similarities between these two stories. You might remember last week, despite perhaps being distracted by our Holy Humor celebrations, that we looked at the passage commonly known as the Doubting Thomas story. And we talked, among other things, about how no matter how hard we might try to lock Jesus out, it doesn't work. He can get in. And all we wind up doing is locking ourselves inside, isolating ourselves from those around us. And so when I read this passage on Sunday night and I started thinking about what the word that God had for us to hear this morning was all about, I was frustrated because on first glance, that story from last week looks and sounds an awful lot like this story. Again, we find the disciples locked away from the world inside their safe house. Again, Jesus miraculously appears among them, and they're scared and amazed. Again, members of the disciples doubt that all of this is real. And again, Jesus presents his pierced hands and side as proof of his identity. So just about everything we talked about last week applies here too, right? So I'll just finish up and we'll go home early. I think it's partially true. In many ways, we are dealing with the same fears and emotions among the disciples that dominated the Doubting Thomas passage that we studied last week. But the more that I read and reread this account from Luke's Gospel, I really think there are enough differences to warrant another look at what may on the surface appear to be a very similar story. And the key thing that I want to talk about today is why it seems so hard for the disciples to accept the fact that Jesus is indeed not dead. What does that mean? Why is it so hard for the disciples to understand? Now, that last question, why it's so hard for the disciples to understand, that question comes from our perspective of looking back across 2,000 years of teaching and preaching and liturgy and hymns and theology. Because let's face it, it's easy for us to proclaim, as we have for the last couple of weeks, that Christ is risen indeed. It kind of just rolls off the tongue. And while this is common practice for us at Easter time, the stories in the Gospels show a starkly different sort of celebration and recognition of Jesus' resurrection. And I think maybe this is part of the reason for these two distinct Gospel stories with similar themes. The repetition is necessary because we need to hear it. And I think it's a message that we probably don't expect to hear from the Bible. When I studied the passage this week, the phrase that kept jumping out to me is in verse 41. While in their joy, the disciples were disbelieving and still wondering. Now think back to last week and you'll see the same thing. Thomas refuses to believe that Jesus is alive until he sees him. And in the end, even that is not good enough. He has to feel the physical wounds in order to make his own decision. Now the same thing happens here. The disciples are locked in a building. Jesus appears and speaks to them, asks them why they have doubts, and then Luke uses this beautiful and loaded phrase, in their joy, they were disbelieving. Isn't that something? The disciples are thrilled that Jesus has joined them, and they're excited that their friend, who they thought was dead, is standing right there talking to them. And even in the midst of that joy and that excitement, they can't believe what they're experiencing. Jesus' disciples have doubts about the resurrection. Now let's sit with that idea for a few minutes. Let's sit with that and think about why that might be the case. Why would the disciples, who are standing there face to face with the resurrected Christ, why did the disciples struggle in order to believe what's going on? And as we think about those things, let's also think about how many of the things that lead to their understanding of that, how many of those things are the same things that we struggle with in our lives of faith today. So the first thing we have to do is remind ourselves of just how truly outrageous this idea of resurrection really is. It rolls off our tongues at Easter without a thought, and that's probably where we should start. As Dr. Caroline Lewis writes, there is the simple truth that our lives are lived in the consciousness of death. And it seems that we have all too many reminders of death around us and not enough reminders of life and resurrection. All we have to do is look at the recent events in the last few months here in our congregation. Over those months, the amount of illnesses and surgeries and hospital stays and other related pastoral care issues have been unusually high. We have a number of folks who are currently in various stages of illnesses or treatments. And while it's very important for us to be concerned for these folks and to care for them and to provide the love and support for them, we talked about it earlier with the prayer shawls. While all of that's important, sometimes our focus on the sick and the dying can cause us to miss the signs of resurrection life that surround us all the time. The truth of the resurrection requires us to look outside of our everyday expectations and experiences. Dr. Lewis also suggests that being able to see the resurrection is difficult because of fear, especially the fear that it could really be true. To quote her, she writes, "Seriously, what if the testimony of the women at the tomb was true? We're in good company when it comes to those fears. The women in Luke's gospel return from the tomb. They go to the disciples and testify to what they themselves had heard and witnessed. And how did the disciples respond? They conclude that all that the women have to say is an idle tale, which some of you may know is the G-rated version of the Greek word that is used there that's better translated as crap or garbage or bull. I'll let you fill in the blank. Like the response to Jesus' first sermon when his hometown friends want to throw him off of a cliff, good news is rarely appreciated on first hearing. Why? Because rejection is easier than resurrection. If the resurrection really is true, well, there goes life as we know it, right? In the words of Anna Carter Florence, if dead people don't even stay dead, what is there that we can count on? The truth of the resurrection requires us to look outside of our everyday expectations and experiences. But that's not an easy thing to do, is it? To look outside of our everyday experiences and expectations. We know how hard that is, and we can see how hard it is for the disciples to do the same thing. And that can make us feel not so good, right? Like maybe we've failed. Like maybe we've let Jesus down if we have doubts from time to time. But in our story today, there's no shame. In both stories, Jesus never gets angry that some of his disciples doubt that this miracle is true. He encourages them to believe. He tries to give them the proof that they require. And he praises those who have not seen and yet believe. But most importantly, there's no shame here. No shame for those who have doubts about the resurrection. And if we're going to be completely honest with ourselves, are there any of us who at one time or another have not had doubts about our faith? Any of us who have not wondered if all this God stuff was really real? Who have not questioned what we believed? Have not questioned what we talk about in church on Sundays? Who've not at one time or another wondered if all of this is just meaningless? I suspect most, if not all of us, have. If you have been on one of our mission trips, you might have one of these cross necklaces that's made out of nails. The necklaces were made by a friend of mine named Dave Wilson. And Dave died earlier this week. He had a 6-month battle with brain cancer. And I've been thinking a lot about him this week. And in the sermon, one memory of him really stood out that kind of fit in with what we're talking about today. One day, and it's been years ago, Dave and I were in a prayer group meeting together with a number of other people. And one of the other group members admitted that they had really been struggling with issues of doubt related to their faith. And this person sheepishly asked if any of the rest of us in the group had ever had the same sorts of struggles. And there was silence for a while, probably because the rest of us were probably afraid to admit in public that we also struggled with doubt from time to time. But Dave spoke boldly that day. And he told our friend, heck yeah, I have doubts all the time. But if I didn't have doubts, what value would my faith have? Dave's faith had a lot of value. Over the years, he probably made tens of thousands of these little crosses. And he'd send them to anybody who asked for them. Mission groups, prayer groups, outreach groups, you name it. He sent those crosses all around the world, often on his own dime. And he had only one request. And he said that when you were wearing that cross, that you should remember that there's always someone else in the world who needs it more than you do. And that if you run into one of those people, give them your cross so that they might experience a little bit of the love of God. That's what these stories are all about. And that's why I think we need to hear them over and over and over again, because we all have our doubts from time to time. But that doesn't make us less of a Christian. It doesn't make us less of a disciple. Doubt is an essential part of our faith. God called the disciples even in their doubt. God called Dave even in his doubts. And God calls you and God calls me even in the midst of our own doubts. And that is good news indeed. Thanks be to God. Amen.